Om vi vill ha ett hum om vad det är som kommer hända här i Sverige, om rådande värdegrund får fortsätta dominera samhället, ja då är det åt Kanada vi ska rikta blicken.
Canada was a very stable, middle class country with reliable institutions. To say that's gone is to say almost nothing.
The Telegraph har gjort en dokumentär om hur Kanada har blivit en radikal woke mardröm. Och nu ska vi titta på de värsta delarna. Först ut är en kanadensisk sjuksköterska som har drabbats av det här woke-drevet efter att hon satt upp en skylt där det stod "Jag hjärta J.K. Rowling", alltså författaren till Harry Potter-böckerna. Och då är det ju så här att J.K. Rowling är cancelled och kallas transfob därför att hon på nätet har skrivit och hon står upp för att bara kvinnor kan vara kvinnor, alltså att män inte kan vara kvinnor bara för att de säger sig identifiera sig som det. Och 2 av alla de här woke-människorna som såg den här skylten blev så kränkta att de valde att rapportera det här till sjuksköterskans tillsynsorgan. Så nu riskerar hon att bli av med sin sjuksköterskelegitimation.
In the past 6, maybe 7 years, I started writing and talking about gender ideology. I'm fighting to maintain my nursing license. The 2 members of the public who complained to my regulatory body were incensed by my involvement in putting up an I Heart J.K. Rowling billboard. This billboard got a lot of attention in Vancouver that has a huge population of very hyper woke, kind of lefty people, and that triggered an investigation. If you hear psychologists talk about the way that some people deal with disagreement, it can be like physical aggression, or you can do more psychological things like reputational destruction and trying to destroy someone that way. And I think as a country, it's almost as if Canadians have chosen to do that. That's what cancel culture feels like here.
Ja, så nu riskerar alltså den här sjuksköterskan att bli av med sin sjuksköterskelegitimation därför att hon står upp för att bara kvinnor kan vara kvinnor. Och det här verkar vara rätt vanligt i Kanada.
My whole goal is to start conversations. It's to have conversations and start conversations. So that was really effective. So I had some signs made. I had 2 signs made. They said gender ideology does not belong in schools. And when you talk about this, all hell breaks loose.
Gender ideology, what the f*** is that?
Do you want to talk about it?
I'm queer, I'm 78, and I've always been queer.
I'm a gay man, I'm not queer.
Well, I
like men, I'm not queer.
Well, the word thing, idiot. It's just a word. I identify as queer.
Okay.
If he's closed mind to accept some other word. Okay.
I'm gay, and you know, when I was young, I was a feminine, fake kid. And, you know, if I was a gay, feminine kid today, they would have whipped out the old dick saw, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
They would have taken my manhood.
Yeah, these kids who would grow up to be gay today are being taught that just because they're effeminate little boys that they must be trans.
I don't know what happened to the Western world. I haven't lived in Canada for 30 years, but it has changed. Man, 30 years ago, this would be unconceivable. I don't like even coming back to the West, you know. I don't recognize it anymore, you know.
Canadians don't want to be on camera if they're supporting this. It's pretty rare.
Why?
Because they might get in trouble at their job. They're not all afraid, and we'll run into them if we stay here long enough. But if people have any sort of corporate job or work for the government, they don't want to be on camera. They're going to get in trouble.
Are you worried about talking about this sort of thing because of your job and things like that?
Yes.
Hon nämner ju ryktesspridning som en form av psykiskt våld och att cancelkulturen härstammar därifrån. Och om vi tittar på Sverige så har vi ju haft samma problematik här i många år nu. Det vill säga att folk har låtit bli att säga vad de faktiskt tycker i rädsla för att bli kallade rasist eller någonting fob och därmed riskerar att bli av med sitt jobb. Nu till en man som är född och uppvuxen i Kanada men som har indiska föräldrar. Han hatar allting som Trudeau har gjort med landet och pratar om att hela samhället är sexualiserat.
You've experienced the gender ideology being pushed on your child. Can you tell us what happened?
In the last few years, the sexualization has become militarized. It has gone full, no pun intended, balls to the wall. They're full on aggressively ramming it down, no pun intended, everyone's throats. It's a Wednesday at around 6 p.m. I get an email and it says, tomorrow is Gender Odyssey. Please bring your kids to school with the other opposite gender's clothing. We're going to have a fashion show. The teachers are going to dress in the opposite gender clothing. We're going to have a presentation for the kids. again, we're talking kids from, you know, grade 4, kids from the ages of 4 all the way up to 11, 12. And I was like, what? They ask me and send me emails and forms to sign when he's crossing the street to go to the, you know, for a field walking trip. And yet they're going to start teaching my son about sexuality, other genders, and God knows what other aspects of sexuality they're going to bring into it without my permission, and that I'm supposed to send him to school with girls' clothing so that he can dress up as a girl and then have a fashion show with all this happening. I was like, no, that's not going to happen.
Vet ni vad det här är? Det här är sjuklöverns dröm om vad Sverige ska bli. Det är drag story hour, det är transkollo för barn, det är transdisco för barn där föräldrar absolut inte får vara med. Det är sexualiseringen av samhället där alla barn ska med. Sen säger den här mannen någonting intressant om multikulti.
And that's the other thing, at school they always have the cultural month. So when it's the South Asian month, they've combined us with, so it's just Asia month. And so me and the East Asians and the parents who are, they want us to come in, they want us to cook the stereotypical Indian and Chinese food. They want us to come and talk about Indian culture, sports and languages and things like that. There's a double-edged sword. We're like, we want your food, we want the kitchen, the camp, and we want everything. We want the image of what your culture is to come in and then leave. But don't bring your actual fundamental beliefs about God, spirituality, and generational like responsibility. Don't bring any of that. We don't want that.
Ja, han pratar alltså om att kanadensarna gärna vill ta del av deras matkulturer i sin vurm för mångkulturen. Men när det kommer till tankar och traditioner, då är de inte alls intresserade. Det här är ju precis som sossar och vänsterliberaler som tycker att utan invandring ingen kebab. Jag tycker såklart inte det är konstigt att man inte vill att dysfunktionella kulturer förändrar ens eget land till det sämre. Men de som förespråkar mångkultur reflekterar sällan över att man inte bara kan välja ut de delar man vill ha ur en kultur och slippa resterande. Kultur är förstås inte bara mat. Och ju större en kulturell grupp blir i ett land, desto mer inflytande kommer de givetvis att kräva. Men hörni, vi behöver faktiskt inte prata mer om mångkultur, för om det är någon som vet vad mångkultur gör med ett land så är det svensken, eller hur? Näst på tur är den bristfälliga sjukvården. En kvinnlig veteran berättar att hon i Trudeaus Kanada inte får de hjälpmedel hon behöver i tid. Däremot har vården helt opåkallat erbjudit henne hjälp med att begå självmord.
You asked for this. Was it the ramp outside you needed?
Yes. I said, you know, I just can't keep going like this. I can't keep living like this. Like, this has to be done, this has to be resolved. And the person stated, you know, Madame Gauthier, if you really feel you can't go on like this, if you really feel you can't do it anymore, you know you have the right to die. So it's like, wow, I can't believe, you know, after all of this time, not only will you not give me the equipment I need to live, but you will help me die. I have been suicidal and in complete desperation for the last 10-15 years. And suddenly you just come out and tell me, you know, if you really can't go on anymore and you feel you can't do it anymore, you just, you know, you have the right to die. Yeah, it's really hard to understand this when you still are maybe blinded enough or stupid enough to believe and think that your government is there to help you and not to end your life because you're becoming too pricey or too much of a problem.
Hon ville alltså leva ett drägligt liv och orkade inte lida mer. Men det blev väl för jobbigt för staten att leva upp till, så de tänkte att hon kan ju lika gärna dö, så slipper vi offra våra resurser på henne. En känd kanadensare som motsätter sig den här samhällsutvecklingen är Jordan B. Peterson, professor emeritus i psykologi.
I also think that if you're the sort of fool who thinks that the government should have the power to aid people in their own death, well, you've got a lot of thinking to do, buddy, because why would you presume that the government is trustworthy enough to do that? I'm an opponent of capital punishment, not because I don't think there are crimes that are sufficiently heinous to deserve death, because there certainly are. And if you don't know that, you don't know anything about crime. And then now we're giving the state that power, well, on compassionate grounds.
Ja, hans hållning är ju då att bara en dåre kan lita tillräckligt mycket på regeringen för att vilja låta dem ha makten att avsluta ens liv.
For a nation to be truly woke, it must have its own narrative of oppression.
Well, in Canada, we don't really have much of a history of slavery at all. So I think that when it comes to our very mixed relationship with Indigenous peoples, the story of our relationship with Indigenous peoples, particularly through residential schools, is a very classic case to be used then as our critical race theory issue.
So in Canada, there is this narrative around what's called the Indigenous genocide. Can you just break that down?
In Canada, we have been fed a narrative that we're a genocidal nation, but it's a narrative that does not do justice to the history. Part of that is through the residential school story.
Let's talk more about this Kamloops mass grave site. So the Kamloops Band, which is the sort of group of Indigenous people there, they put out a statement a few years ago saying that they'd found this mass grave site and they'd done some scans of the grounds, and they claimed that there were 215 disturbances within the grounds, which they said were evidence of human remains, even children who were basically being killed or wiped out. Is that actually evidence of a genocide? Have they dug up the grounds? Have they found the bodies?
No evidence has been found to date. In fact, the sonar seeking devices are not indications of any grave. To suggest otherwise is utter nonsense. So those claims need to be investigated, like any other claim of a crime scene. They need to be looked at.
As you say, crucially, they haven't actually dug up these sites.
No, they've not been excavated, they've not been exhumed or anything like that. So it has really become a kind of a bizarre type of claim. This is not just simply about the story of residential schools. This is the story of how a nation has, I believe, been infected by a really destructive, hate-filled ideology of wokeism.
So you could actually be facing prison time potentially if you question this Indigenous genocide narrative?
Well, certainly if you listen to the openness of the current Minister of Justice federally, yes, we have a risk that they will seek to criminalize any questioning of the residential school narrative or the claims of mass graves, which is utterly absurd.
Questioning the Indigenous genocide story already has its consequences. So you were a teacher, you're no longer a teacher. Why?
One day 2 years ago, I was teaching Calculus 12 to older students, and news had broken right across the world about 215 children being murdered in an Indian residential school. I said that day to students, and I was expected to reproduce the narrative about, oh yes, white Christians had just made a mess of Canada and had done so forever, and they were mass murderers now. And in Canada, the men and women in this particular school in Kamloops, it was Oblate priests and brothers and sisters of St. Anne. They devoted themselves fully to the education of young people. They came from Europe to do so. The idea that they put children in incinerators or hanged them and secretly buried them at night and all that sort of stuff is just, why would you say that to students if it's not true? All I said was the kids died from disease, and they did die from disease. Nobody has since questioned. But I was walked out within half an hour of mentioning that one comment, suggesting, I didn't even say it wasn't murder, but the very suggestion that it wasn't genocide. They walked, two vice principals walked me, frog marched me out of the school. And I haven't been teaching since, and I've been told that I never will.
I Kanada har de alltså tagit sig an kritisk rasteori till fullo. Woke-folket är ju beroende av white man bad-narrativet, vare sig det är i Kanada eller här i Sverige. Kanada är ju praktiskt taget Sverige några steg framåt på woke-stigen.
The bill C4 in Canada is the bill that criminalizes parents and therapists who want to help gender dysphoria kids, and if you do that you may go in jail up to 5 years. But that bill also is doing the promotion of the transition, and for me there's no transition. You have boys and the girls cannot be a boy and a boy cannot be a girl. But for the Conservative, and every member of parliament voted for that bill, voted for the bill C4.
Det är alltså olagligt för en förälder eller en terapeut att försöka tala ett barn till rätta som påstår sig ha det motsatta könet. Så om din son kommer till dig och säger mamma eller pappa, jag är en flicka, då får inte du säga nej hörru du Pelle, du är en pojke. Det är olagligt att säga så. Och med tanke på hur snabbt allt det här har spridit sig i Sverige också, så är det inte alls osannolikt att vi också skulle kunna få en sån lag i framtiden. Och här gäller det att vi inte varvar ner och lugnar ner oss och tänker att vi har ju en högerregering, så här är det inte möjligt att något sånt kan ske. För om ni tittar på hur regeringsföreträdare gick ut och försvarade transvestiternas sagostunder med småbarn i våras, så förstår ni ju att även om det kanske tar lite längre tid för en liberal eller moderat att köpa hela woke-narrativet i alla frågor, så kommer det alltid landa där till slut. Så här gäller det verkligen att vi står på oss och fortsätter prata om det här. För annars kommer det här bara kunna glida igenom utan att någon ens märker någonting. Nej, trots att hela den här dokumentären lämnar lite av en känsla som ja, what's new, så får vi ändå försöka se det här som en varning till resten av västvärlden, inklusive Sverige. För det kommer bara bli värre om vi fortsätter vandra på den här woke-stigen.
What is it about Canada itself that Canada has gone so far to the left? And maybe you disagree that Canada is an outlier compared to other Western nations. You can explain
No,
that.
I think we've gone further down the woke road than, you know, any other place except perhaps for California. I think part of the reason for that is that we were an early adopter of the doctrines of group rights. The Francophones had rights, the Indigenous people as a group had rights, the Anglophones had rights. There were 3 founding peoples, and group and individual rights had to be balanced. And I don't think there is any such thing as group rights because there's no such thing as group responsibility. So it's a non-starter conceptually. And so in some ways the table was set in Canada for the rise of a more universal doctrine of group identity and group rights. And plus Canadians pride themselves on, you know, being nice, let's say, and, you know, and not being offensive and just hoping that everyone will get along. And, you know, there's nothing glorious about incivility, but there's very little to distinguish excessive niceness from weakness. And the problem with being nice, and this is a technical problem because niceness is associated with trait agreeableness, is that agreeable people are cannon fodder for psychopaths. So I don't believe that any of the conundrum that we're in at the moment in the West is strictly political. I think what's happened is that the predatory psychopaths have figured out how to cloak themselves in the guise of compassion.
Låter det där bekant kanske?